Accepting that naturalized epistemology is a task for the philosopher, it would seem, or it might seem at first, that that could exist happily alongside more traditional epistemology. So I wanted to ask you about a couple of aspects of traditional epistemology. One project in traditional epistemology has been to try to say what knowledge is, what the word knowledge means. And in that project, a watershed came a few years back. There'd been a very dominant view that knowledge is a matter of getting the right answer, having a true belief and having the right to be certain or being justified, something like that. And then Edmund Gettier came along with some examples which seemed to show that that was a decisively wrong account. And then traditional epistemology took on a rather different form, trying to define knowledge, leaning quite heavily on notions like causation and relations to the external world. How would you view that watershed in traditional epistemology?
Here again, the same old pattern of questioning a dichotomy. In this case, the watershed itself. Well, the dichotomy I'm wondering about, namely between belief, true belief, and justified belief, and this I would find a matter of degree. Here we believe it, on what grounds, and how well is this belief going to stand up against challenge, and so the challenge then maybe precipitates a further experiment to justify the theory in question, and that I feel that I've doubted the demarcation between true belief, other than knowledge, and knowledge itself. In fact, I felt that this is a case where a rather paradoxical situation where epistemology, in other words, theory of knowledge, has as one of its findings that there's no such thing as knowledge, that knowledge is not a legitimate concept.
I'd love to pursue that line further. Let's just for a moment, though, turn to another major project in traditional epistemology. That's trying to address skeptical arguments. So how do I know that I'm not dreaming? What justification could I possibly have for thinking that there's an external world? These are classical questions. What kind of response do you have to those questions?
Good. Now, this is where naturalism comes in, certainly in full force. Namely, I can understand the terms dreaming or reality of external world and all that only relative to the sorts of tests that would induce or reinforce my belief in applying these various terms. Now, the difference between dreaming and waking, for instance, well, we know how, we seem to know the good many ways in which we conclude that we're not dreaming. We have these long systematic memories. We'd be very much surprised if this turned out to be just pseudo-memories that were implanted recently when we fell asleep. It's a question here, as in empirical science generally, a question of implausibility. What is the likeliest? And there's no question of absolute certainty about it. I think that perhaps my answer to skepticism, in a word and in general, is just that again, it's a matter of not of there being no end point. It's just a matter of extreme improbability in view of the rest of our systematic overall theory, the theory in terms of which we say that there are wombats, there are no unicorns, and we say we're awake, not dreaming. Once in a while, I think each of us has had a surprise in that respect. He thought he wasn't dreaming, and it turned out he was. So we can imagine this unlikely thing. I think another parallel point that it was Eddington pointing out that it's physically possible, it's compatible with physical laws, that all the water in a jug find itself just on one side, one half of the jug, just because of the random movements of the molecules, that they just happen to get, by chance, to get over there at the same time, same place, and the molecules of air being down the other side. Yes, how improbable. And I think that this is the realistic way to look at impossibility and, on the one hand, and certainty on the other. That it's just that matter of degree. And so my answer to skepticism in general would be, I mean, the whole thing may be false, or even apart from dreaming and waking. Here our expectations, the expectations on which our scientific laws are based, depend ultimately on inductions that we've made, predictions of future experience, generally following the principle that if things happen under seemingly the same circumstances as they happened before, they will happen again. And if we reproduce the conditions, we get those results. It could turn out that suddenly there's systematically a lot of surprises, and our old theories aren't working at all well anymore. Again, this, by our regular scientific standards and practices, is vanishingly probable.
These issues about justification and knowledge are issues of how we're able to arrive at the truth, or perhaps if we're able to arrive at the truth. But what, in your view, is it for something to be true? What is truth, according to you?
What is truth? It seems to me that Tarski brought out the essence of truth in his paradigm. The paradigm was, snow is white, in quotation marks, here we're talking about the sentence. Snow is white, that sentence is true, if and only if snow is white. How do we determine whether something is true? It all depends on the example. Take Tarski's example. We get some snow, and we examine its color, and see whether the term applies. And whatever the subject is, if there's a puzzle as to what it means to call the sentence true, I say, don't blame the concept of truth, blame the sentence. If the sentence is clear, the sentence itself is telling you what would have to be the case in order for it to be true. So here we have what regrettably and mistakenly F.P. Ramsey called the disappearance theory of truth. He felt, as others have felt, Ayer did at one point apparently, that you don't need the notion of truth, you just have these sentences. We do need the notion of truth, but for quite a humdrum reason. Namely, you often want to say something like, almost everything he said in that lecture was true. You can't get rid of the word true there by eliminating quotation marks, as in the case of snow is white, because there are none. Again, you want to say in a logic lesson that every sentence of the form, quote, if P, then P or Q, unquote, is true. You can't go enumerating all those sentences. They're infinite in number. We need truth for just for such situations, which still makes truth a humdrum concept. But then there's one further, I think, very important proviso or that has to be added to all this. Namely, in science, when a theory that seemed to be going along fine, we said it was true, runs into difficulty and a change is made, we don't say That used to be true, but it's no longer true. We say, we thought it was true, turns out not to be. This is a very special trait of this notion of truth, which does go beyond the sort of trivialities that I've been sketching. Namely that it's, well, Kant's phrase, ideal of pure reason, it seems to me to fit it nicely, although that's not something I can satisfactorily define either. It's an ideal. And we're aiming at this ideal, even though we perhaps can't make sense of it. It's I think it may reduce simply to a characterization of our idiom, our usage. Namely, our usage is not to say that truth changes with the progress of science. Our usage is to say that our conception of what is true changes with the progress of science. Charles Sanders Peirce tried to accommodate this situation by defining truth as the limit approached as science goes on forever. But this doesn't. I think this is a good figure of speech. Science is not going to go on forever, and furthermore, it's not even clear that as science does progress, after a point anyway in the future, it's going to be it's going to be doing better and better, better and better. What do I mean by that? Our test of better and better in the case of science is experimental testing and seeing whether the experiment comes out the way you predicted it would come out. And we may have more and more success. We do have more and more success by that standard as time goes on. But it was just a pious hope on or a dream on Peirce's part that was going to continue and finally approach a limit of one unique doctrine. So I don't think there's any hope there. I think we have to say, well, this is the way. We have this scientific practice, the nature of science, is to frame hypotheses and go on testing them by experiment, and when they fail, tinkering and making improvements and going on and testing again by experiment. And this is the kind of thing that's made life easier in many ways and harder in many ways, and has made for technology. There's the situation. And then we come to our idiom in describing what's going on here. And our idiom just happens to have this curious twist in it, that we talk about something having been supposed true but not having been true, rather than talking of something as having been true and no longer being true.
Could I just ask, before we go on to the next question, if the Peirce idea had worked out, that would have only been an account of scientific truth. Do you think scientific truth is all the truth there is?
Yes, I think I do, but I think I cheat here by putting so much into science, including mathematics. And there's another boundary that I tend to blur between mathematics and natural science. And then as for values, well, I just hesitate to use the term true there. Things are better and worse from one point of view or another.
Now, here are some sentences of yours which I think are true, and I think you think they're true, and maybe they're scientific truths. It's about consciousness. You say, if we repudiate mental entities as entities, there ceases to be an iron curtain between the private and the public. There remains only a smokescreen, a matter of varying degrees of privacy of events in the physical world. Consciousness still retains a place as a state of a physical object if we construe consciousness as a faculty of responding to one's own responses. Now, that's an absolutely crystal clear and forthright statement of up-to-the-minute materialism, but you said this back in 1952. You were more than a decade ahead of J.J.C. Smart and the Australian materialists in announcing your allegiance to materialism. But back in the 50s, if you went and looked to see what the neurophysiologists thought, they weren't at all convinced that materialism was true. So is this part of your flexible definition of science, that this is a scientific truth that coming from, say, an epistemologist, where your epistemological avenue to this truth lets you get out ahead of science and the rest of science in this way?
I think this may be that the neurologists in those days weren't being as critically philosophical as they might have been, but it's the same domain, the same sort of truth.